In order to design a sustainable landscape, it's really important to understand the characteristics of where we live. So in this next section, we're going to talk about our climate. We're going to talk a little bit about how our climate works with your landscape so that you can have a sense of what you can do in your landscape, what kinds of plants you can bring in to make a truly climate-adapted, watershed-friendly, beautiful landscape. Here in California, we are one of 5 Mediterranean climate zones of the world, and you can see them here on this map. We're in California. You can see the countries ringing the Mediterranean basin, southwestern Africa, southwestern Australia, and the west coast of Chile. All of these landscapes are considered, or these places are considered to have Mediterranean climate zones. But they're not all equal. In fact, the plants are different, the animals are different, the soil characteristics are different, even the rainfall patterns are different. The thing that makes each of these climates so rare and unique is that they all go through long periods of drought every year. Now, some places, for example, the Mediterranean parts of Europe, they may get double the rainfall that we get here. We're one of the drier Mediterranean climates. So what we have to think about is, if we go to a plant nursery and we're looking for plants and they say, oh, all of the Mediterranean garden regions have plants that you can grow in your garden. That is true to a point, but many of them will need extra water. Many of them won't interact with our butterflies and pollinators and all of that stuff because our climates, each one of us individually, have evolved to host so many unique species that don't exist anywhere else in the world. That's part of the reason why this class and this program is focused on native plants, is because that's a really important thing to understand about being part of Mediterranean climate zones, and that is that it's the summer dry aspect. That is the important thing. So let's look at that in a little bit more depth so you know what I mean. So many of us are from different kinds of climates. They're not summer dry climates. In fact, I'm from a climate originally that has a lot of summer rain. And so if I try to take the plants from that climate and grow them in my climate, I'm going to have to emulate that climate here in our arid Mediterranean region in order to have healthy plants. That is the way conventional landscaping thinks. So we're switching our thinking, and I'll show you how that works. So in a conventional garden, in a garden that is a non-Mediterranean garden, maybe using plants from Korea or China or New York or Florida, that isn't like our climate, this is the way we think about planting and establishing a garden. And establishing a garden is just really that first 3 months that the plants need to get their roots in the ground, that first 3 months. So to plant and establish a garden in a non-Mediterranean climate, a lot of times all the fun stuff starts in the spring. And you can see on this graph that the blue lines represent precipitation or rainfall, natural rainfall. The yellow represents sun, right? Because plants need to photosynthesize from the sun. And the green represents the gardening season. And that's what we all care about. When do we plant our garden? What's the best time? Well, in New York or Florida or any of these other non-Mediterranean regions, which could also be the desert, by the way, and we'll talk about that in a moment. You plant your garden in the spring. We're still getting precipitation. We're still getting rainfall. The sun is coming out in the Pacific Northwest. Everyone's happy because the sun is coming out. And so you can establish your garden with that sun and with that rain through the spring all the way to the autumn. And then in the winter, usually we spend that time designing. Well, if you take California native plants that didn't evolve in a non-Mediterranean climate and you use that gardening model, you are going to immediately run into trouble. And I'll show you why. And I'll show you a better way to handle the landscape planting and establishment of a California native garden. In a California native garden, everything is almost flipped upside down. So we want to plant our gardens in the autumn because that is when our rain is starting to ramp up. We always get plenty of sun, so we never have to worry that a plant doesn't get enough sun to photosynthesize. So in the fall, we start planting our gardens. We plant all the way around to the spring so that we have a little buffer in the late spring so the plants can get their roots in the ground and then they hunker down for that hot, dry season. That is a big difference between California native plants and plants from other places, is they're used to that. That's what they evolved with. So that's how different it is to plant a native garden versus a conventional garden. Now, this is an example of how dramatic the difference can be between planting a traditional garden with even Mediterranean plants or plants that are called drought tolerant. You'll see that term a lot. I don't really like that term because it's not helpful to a gardener. But I want to show you this because it's important to understand the water needs of native plants versus lawn versus traditional drought-tolerant shrubs so that you can get a sense of how to line up your planted garden, the plants that you choose for your garden, with our climate, just the way it is. So you'll see the light green line is the water use of California natives. The blue line is the rainfall that falls yearly, and this is taken over an average of about 5 years. The lawn needs a lot more water. Look at that dark green line, how much water a lawn needs versus what we get. And then look at the line of the drought-tolerant plant. So these are typical plants we see in our landscape. They might be lavender or natal plum or Indian hawthorn. All of those plants, they may not out and out die if you don't water them in the summer, but honestly, you might wish they would because they'll look so bad. So what you really want to do is you want to think about putting in plants that actually require less water in the summer versus those other plants. And here's how dramatic that can be. California natives in a garden context are going to need a little bit of water. They don't get that out in the dry and dusties, but they will get that in your garden. And so they can look beautiful all the time. So you may need to give them a little bit of supplementation in the dry months so that they can keep fresh and green. But look at the water that a so-called drought-tolerant plant needs. It needs a lot more. So that is a dramatic difference when we're looking at natives versus the kinds of plants that we're told are drought-tolerant. So now we're going to talk about how to choose plants for our landscape. And this is really an important thing to think about because California has many different microclimates, as you know, and many of these microclimates, they actually map to specific plants. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. If you're in Mission Viejo and you have a hot southwest-facing slope, and no matter what you plant there, it doesn't grow, you have a chaparral climate zone. And there are plants, such as the ones that you see in this picture, that evolved with hot, sunny slopes. They evolved to hold the slopes. They evolved to be perfectly happy with low levels of summer water, if any. For those of you who have a house blocking the sun on one side of your property, well, we have a microclimate in California called the oak woodland. And that is kind of what you've created when your house was constructed there. It's created a cool and shady area. And we have a whole plant palette surrounding these under and amongst this shady oak woodland. And we can use those plants in the shady north side or east side of your house. And then for those of you who are in the cooler parts of Molten Nigal's water district, maybe Dana Point, maybe places in Laguna Niguel where you get fog, you have so many plants to choose from. But all of these kinds of plants evolved with salt-laden fog, and they evolve with a cool sun, not the hot sun that we see farther inland. In this next segment, we're going to talk about soil. And to a plant, soil is everything. But to many of you, soil might be a little mysterious. So we're going to start with a pop quiz. I'm going to describe to you how these two soil samples were taken so that you can really get a sense of how a plant or even rain experiences our soil. So these are two soil samples. They're about 1 foot deep and about 1 inch wide. And they really provide a little snapshot into the conditions in the soil in a specific place. One of these samples was taken way off trail, off of the side of a hill near Camp Pendleton. So nobody ever touched that spot. I hiked off the trail and I grabbed a soil sample. The other sample was taken about a 5-10 minute walk away in a garden. And when you look at these two soils, I want you to think about which is which. Which is the natural soil, untouched, and which is the soil that was in a garden. All right, so the reason we need to care about which soil is which is because our soils in our landscapes should look like the soil on the right, and that is wild soil. Now look at the health of that soil. It's dark, rich brown. Think carbon. It almost looks like coffee grounds. Imagine when it rains. What happens when rain goes through that soil? You can see that it would just soak it up just like a sponge. There are some things that you can't see in that soil that make it super healthy, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But look at the soil on the left. That is the soil under a lawn in a regular community like many of you live in. That is not healthy soil for a plant. So our goal in our landscapes is to turn that soil on the left into the soil on the right. And we can do that. It's not difficult. It's more about what we don't do than what we actually have to do. So this whole next section is going to be about how do we turn our soil, which probably looks a lot like the compacted, nutrient-poor soil on the left, to a living soil sponge, which is what we see on the right. The thing to know about soil is that soil and soil organisms and plants are so interconnected that they behave basically like one thing. So there are so many organisms in soil that keep plants healthy, that feed plants nutrients and water, that connect plants to each other, and we can't even see them. They're microscopic. But we can accidentally do things to our soil that stop them from thriving. And so what we want to do when we think about soil is we want to know that they're there, first of all, and we want to make sure that we don't do anything to disrupt them. And you can see the garden on the right has really healthy soil because it has really healthy plants. Now, this does not mean that we want to add fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and all that stuff to our soil. We really want to create a healthy soil, and that healthy soil can do all of that for us. And something to note also in a healthy landscape, when your soil is really a healthy, thriving soil, that soil is connecting up all the native plants in your landscape, feeding them, watering them, and keeping them healthy through this, what scientists have called the wood wide web, which is this fungal network that keeps all of the plants healthy and connected together. That's something we can really nurture in our landscapes. But in order to do that, we need to stop using synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. This is an example of a landscape where, probably by accident, a lot of the wrong things were done. So one of the things that happened with this tree, and sadly this tree is since disappeared off the planet. Actually, this tree, because this is in my neighborhood, so I know exactly where this tree is, it was replaced twice using the same methods that caused its demise the first 2 times. So let me tell you what they should have done when they planted this tree so that they would have a healthy soil system and then a healthy tree. So they planted this tree and they did not put any covering over the soil. No ground cover, no mulch, nothing. And then the tree was irrigated with a very high pressure spray, which compacted the soil. That's one thing you want to know about your own garden. Probably the most important thing that you can do with your soil is ensure that it doesn't become compacted. And there's 2 things that compact soil. Pressure on it, such as from walking or irrigation or machinery when it is wet. That is really the most important thing that you can do to create healthy soil, is don't compress it when it's wet. And if you can do that, you can allow the water to infiltrate soil, and that would help this plant, this tree in this case, not become a surface rooting tree. This tree doesn't want to be a surface rooting tree. It wants to go deep into the soil with its roots. But because the soil's so compacted, it can't do that. So we're going to talk for a minute about how do you create an environment for your trees, your shrubs, your plants that allows them to go deep for water so that you don't have to water very much, and so that the living soil system can keep them healthy, irrigated, and strong. And that involves building life in soil. So here's how you do it. Soil should be covered either by plants or by wood chip mulch or by leaves that have fallen from trees. So if you have an oak tree in your yard and that oak tree drops leaves, do not blow those leaves away, because the reason that plants drop leaves is actually to feed themselves. They know if they drop the leaves, the soil organisms are going to drag them down, they're going to decompose them, and they're going to feed those leaves right back to that plant. So when we blow all of our leaves away, we're essentially starving that plant of its ability to create its own food using its partners in the soil. That's a really key point to know. But in a new garden, a lot of times we don't have that. We just have our new plants and we have our soil. So what we want to do in a new garden, when we plant our plants, we want to put a couple of handfuls of compost in the planting hole. Not very much. All we're trying to do is transition that baby plant into the soil. There's two different kinds of soil that you're dealing with when you plant a plant. You're dealing with the soil that's in the container, and you're dealing with the soil that's in your yard. And that container soil is perfect soil, because that's what the nursery or the grower who grew that plant knew that plant wanted, and that grower made it perfect. So you have to coax that plant's roots into your soil. And the way that you do that is you put just a couple of handfuls of organic compost. You can buy it in bags or you can buy it in bulk. It always goes into the soil. After you've planted your plant and you've watered your plant in, you actually want to seal the top of the soil with 3 inches of wood chip mulch. And that has been proven by science time and time again to do 3 things: hold moisture in soil, suppress weeds, and slowly break down into essentially compost that then feeds your soil organisms. So until your plants are producing their own mulch by dropping little bits of leaves on the ground, or flowers, or little bits of duff that fall from the plants, until that happens, you're going to want to keep that layer of wood chip mulch on your soil. Now, many people will say that our native bees, which we're going to talk about shortly, require a little bit of open soil in order to nest. And we'll talk about that in a moment. They will find a place to nest. You might want to keep a few areas, probably less than 10% of your landscape, open to them if you are really interested in protecting our pollinators, which you should be. But don't focus completely upon leaving your soil bare for them. It really has to be covered by mulch in order to get your garden sort of started off right and established correctly. So that's compost and wood chip mulch and how they work in a garden, in a new garden. But I'll tell you what a lot of people ask me for. A lot of people say, I don't want to use wood chip mulch in my garden. I want to mulch it, which is, put stuff on top of the soil. I want to mulch it with gravel. Well, here's how I advise people who want to do that. First of all, normally they want to do it for purely aesthetics. They just like the look of gravel. But if you want to have a healthy garden, you actually need to focus on what the plant needs to be healthy. And there are certain plants that grow in environments that are very kind of rocky, gravelly, that don't mind having a mulch that is a gravel. But most of the plants that lose their leaves, the shrubs, the ground covers, the trees, they actually want a wood chip mulch because that's kind of what they're producing for themselves. So be careful how you use gravel as a mulch, and be specific and understand if that plant wants gravel as a mulch, if it will grow best that way, because that's really what you want, is a thriving garden. And then some people will say, I want to use decomposed granite as a mulch. And that is that material that is basically crushed granite. It's crushed rock, and it almost looks like sand. It's a great path material, and that's usually how we use it, is as a pathway. If you use it as a mulch in your garden, what we have found is it does not lead to a low maintenance garden, because it just turns out that weeds actually really like to germinate in decomposed granite. So we really would prefer that you used wood chip mulch when your garden is young as a covering for the soil. And then one of the benefits to living in California with our fantastic sun means that we can grow a lot of things here if we only give them enough water. Well, we don't want to grow everything that we could possibly grow here, because some of the things that have been introduced to our gardens have escaped our gardens, and they've created a habitat problem outside of our gardens. So for example, these 3 plants are big offenders. They're called invasive plants. And California spends millions of dollars every year trying to combat these invasive plants that have escaped into our wildlands, and they cause a fire risk, and they take over habitat, so our native species can't use them anymore. So they go in and they try to eradicate them. And the irony is they got there because of our gardens. All of these 3 were horticultural introductions that got into our wildlands through our gardens. So just remove them. If you have any of these 3, don't plant them, remove them. And there really aren't that many. But ivy is another one that's a big problem that many people have in their gardens. So take a look at California's invasive plant Council website if you want to know exactly what's invasive and what isn't. There's also another great website called Plant Right, and it tells you what the top 10 invaders are. So just look at that, make sure none of those are in your garden. So now we're going to start talking about pests in the garden. What is a pest and what isn't a pest? And how is it that we can have a watershed-friendly, sustainable garden and also make it hospitable to insects? That idea alone may be shocking to some of you, because our insects are in trouble. And so we need to look at our landscapes as a place that fosters all of life, not just a select few organisms. But when we think about insects, there are insects that kind of do cause us problems in our landscapes. And there are insects that we really want to have there, and those are called beneficial insects. So we're going to take a little look at both of them right now. So let's just say this is your rose leaf. This is a rose, by the way. I'm sure some of you know that. And you notice this damage on your rose leaf. So there's a couple things that you can do. You can decide whether you want to do anything at all. And when we think about ecological pest management, managing pests in our landscape using ecological thinking, right, we first have to decide if we want to do anything at all. And so many times we take a wait and see approach. We wait for 3 weeks and we see if the problem hasn't solved itself. If the problem has gotten substantially worse, maybe we take a different tactic after that 3 weeks. But look at this one. This is an example of why we shouldn't see damage and immediately run to the garage for the broad spectrum pesticides. We should never use broad spectrum pesticides, full stop. They have no place in our garage and they have no place in our landscapes. So let's get rid of all broad spectrum pesticides. And those are the ones that have those big long lists of every insect under the sun on the back label. We don't need those anymore. Okay, but here we are still faced with a leaf that has some damage. So what did damage this leaf? Sometimes we think, well, maybe it was a snail. It's not a snail, because snails always leave evidence of the crime. They always leave a snail trail. Well, maybe it was aphids. Roses are famous for hosting large quantities of aphids. Well, we know it can't be an aphid, because aphids are there in the daytime. We would see them. They're sucking insects. They would be sucking those leaves, and we would see that. So we know it's not an aphid. Could it be a rabbit? We know we have a rabbit issue in our region. Well, it's not a rabbit because rabbits don't take these perfectly symmetrical little bites. Could it be a rat? Can't be a rat. Rats come and they chop off plants at an angle. You'll always know when a rat came because they'll chop it off at an angle and they'll drag it away. You won't still see the plant there if they came after it. So what is it then? Well, it turns out that this particular piece of leaf damage was created by one of California's 1,600 native bees. We are one of the most important states for native bees because we have such a high proportion of the total bees, native bees in our on our continent, located here in California, and those bees are in trouble because of pesticides, herbicides, and all the sides. Here's what's interesting about this particular bee, and many native bees. This is a leafcutter bee. It's really important, along with its brethren, the other native bees, really important pollinators of our food. In fact, every third sip or bite of food comes to us courtesy of a bee, and in particular a native bee. So what this little bee does, it's a solitary bee. It doesn't sting, it doesn't hive, and it doesn't swarm. It takes these little circles and it builds a little tiny kind of a condo way off in the back 40 of your soil for its young. So now that you know that this damage was created by this really important part of our community, would you go and spray this plant? Well, no, of course you wouldn't. So this is why this idea of understanding what it is that's damaging your plants and whether you need to act or not, usually not, is so important to this idea of ecological pest management and a watershed-friendly garden. And something to keep in mind, we have many insects, in fact, vastly more insects in our landscapes that are either benign and really do nothing to us, to hurt us or to scare us or to bite us or sting us. We have more benign insects, or actually helpful insects, than we have pests. So here's an example of a whole bunch of helpful insects. These insects are the insects that eat the kind of pest insects that usually bother us, like whitefly and aphids and mealybugs. The top row shows you the adult form, which all of them have wings and can fly away when they see us coming with the spray bottle. But the lower ones are their young. If you see those on your plants, it means you have a hospitable place for life on your plants. And those young of the ladybug, of the lacewing, and of the mealybug destroyer eat far more of those pest insects than their mothers do. And if we do spray our plants, even with safe, organic pesticides, they will kill the young of those beneficial insects, which we don't want to do. So this is a really good reason to wait and see and wait and watch before you do anything to interact with the natural cycles in your landscape. It's important to know when you plant a native plant or a plant that our butterflies, bees, caterpillars, birds recognize as home or habitat or food, you're going to see them come to your plant. So here's a great example. This is a beautiful plant. It's called winter senna. It's a shrub. It's about maybe 8 feet tall. It can even be formed into a small tree in a small garden. It's a really lovely plant. It has a relationship that goes back millennia with this little creature. And this is a caterpillar. And this caterpillar will go through and it will chew on some leaves. You probably won't even be able to see what it's done if you stand 10 feet away. But it'll be there. It turns into this little chrysalis after about 3 weeks maybe. That chrysalis will sit there for maybe another 3 weeks, not bothering anybody, and then you'll have the emergence of this beautiful sulfur butterfly. So one of the things that's really great about using native plants or plants that have these kinds of relationships is your gardens become so much more interesting and so much more beautiful. And the beneficial effect of birds on our landscapes cannot be overstated. Birds are critically important to a healthy landscape. In fact, you can judge the health of your landscape by how many different birds you see in it on a daily basis. When birds are nesting and they lay their eggs and the eggs hatch and they have young in their nests, they feed those young baby birds only insects. I mean, to all intents and purposes, only insects. 96% of the birds on this planet feed their young only insects. So if your yard is not a hospitable place for insects, I can almost promise you your HOA is not a hospitable place for insects. Where are those baby birds going to find their food? Where is that mother going to find the food to feed their young? Keep this in mind. An example of a bird that needs to find food to feed her young, and it has to be insects, is a wren. We see wrens all the time. They're the little chattery things. They're very cute and they're small. They need between 600 and 1,100 insects per day to feed their nestlings over a 3-week period. If they can't find that in your garden or in your HOA common area, where are they going to find it? If that's not a good argument for encouraging insects into your garden, I don't know what is. By the way, birds are in trouble too because of our overuse of pesticides. To have this sustainable landscape, to have this watershed-friendly landscape, means really changing our relationship with the organisms that use our landscapes as home. And it's important to know that all the things that we don't want in our landscapes, birds will eat. So our relationship with birds is important. One thing we can do to help birds is don't trim our trees between March and August, because that is when birds are nesting. And if we can leave them alone between March and August, we will really help to rebound their numbers, to help their numbers rebound in our region. Now, you can see why I don't even want to call it pest management, because now we know most of what's in our yards aren't even pests at all. This is why we want to change our relationships to insects, and we want to start welcoming them into our yard, and we want to use ecological pest management. Think of the ecology of our yards first before we consider whether something is really a pest or not.